past is another country, or so they say. But our sense of the present is really an accumulation of memories, not just of our own, but of people long gone. What we are today is determined by what's been before. To understand any society, it's necessary to sift the evidence of its history. The problem is that most of what we call history is the stuff of documents. And words, even pictures, don't always tell the whole truth. But there is other, more tangible evidence from which we can learn a great deal, if we get the chance. Through the process of archaeology, history stares us in the face. To unearth a relic from antiquity is to cut the convention of time, to connect us directly with the lives of our predecessors. But this is not ancient Egypt, it's contemporary Australia. The techniques of archaeology are precisely the same as those used in the ancient world.
Oh, wow, look. Oh, broken.
But what makes it exciting is that this material evidence of our forebears has a direct resonance, a more immediate relevance to us than anything unearthed from the tombs of the pharaohs. This is Melbourne, Australia. In the history of cities, it is very young. Within scarcely 150 years, it's been transformed from a village of huts into a great metropolis. It's a city which is still building its monuments. This is one of the biggest government office buildings ever built in Australia. A development by the Department of Administrative Services, DAS, and Telecom. But it was also the site of the most extensive urban archaeological dig ever undertaken in Australia.
We began digging at the beginning of January 1988, and no development has occurred really on the site since about 1917 or 1918. So it missed out on that whole 60s and 70s building boom, and we felt that because buildings just been knocked down to ground level and then asphalt and gravel put over them to create the car parks, there was likely to be a lot of archaeological deposits intact on the site. So we felt there was a lot of potential there.
Unlike many developers, DAS felt the site was worthy of study before it was destroyed to make way for a 42-storey tower. They took advice from the Victoria Archaeological Survey.
Investigations during the pre-planning phase of the exercise revealed that we had a unique opportunity on this site, that the site had not been developed at all since about the turn of the century.
The archaeologists were given just 16 weeks to complete the dig. What they found in that time was remarkable.
A big bottle here. Tin bottle there. Grace is good. That's a lovely bottle.
Tens of thousands of artifacts were unearthed, an extraordinary chronicle of the way people lived and worked as the embryonic town evolved into a major city.
Now 16 weeks to dig 6,000 metres is not very much time. We only had 4 paid archaeological staff as trained people. And so we knew from the outset we were going to need volunteers on the job. For people to get down there and be able to dig is a really great experience for them. And actually where we were digging in these old cottage floors, and we could pretty well guarantee that people were going to find things in those deposits, that thrill of discovery is what the volunteers love, that moment of unearthing something that they've found that goes back 100, 150 years.
This area was known as Little Lon, a term which for almost a century was an affront to the virtuous, a blot on the landscape of marvellous Melbourne. The reality is impossible to gauge from the salacious journals of the 19th century. But it is known that the area was home to thousands of working people. The destitute, immigrants seeking fellowship, and searching in vain for a better life.
We're working in a section which shows the 4 phases of development of the site. Up the top horizon is the car park, which was just put there in the 1960s. Then you have this horizon here, which is a demolition when the houses were knocked down a bit early on. And then we do a big leap in time and we go back to about the 1870s with this horizon here, which we find all over the site, and it's the polluted soil of Melbourne when all the sewer pits were overflowing. And the records show of that time that people were saying that there was going to be about 2 foot of polluted soil all through Melbourne. And this is what we got left of it. Underneath the polluted soil we have the natural ground level. So there you're starting to talk about an Aboriginal landscape.
Some of the thousands of artefacts excavated through the dig may go on display in the museum. Selecting them will not be as hard as it may seem, since all the material uncovered has been meticulously sorted and classified.
What you see before you is a sort of spread of the usual items we get out of the buckets. And here we divide them into the materials first, like glass, ceramics, special items like tobacco pipes and bone, and some more ceramics over there. And then from this general mass of items we called accession items that just go on the register with one line of description, we take out special items, and these include things like tobacco pipes with some pattern or design that can be readily identified, and things too like the leather and the clothing. We've got quite a few material items. This is a child's slipper. It's lost a lot of the tacks and the sewing that keeps it together, but it's still sort of come out basically in that shape. So it's nice to have things like that coming out, which are more evocative of the people who wore them, used them.
Many of the pieces weren't of sufficient quality to rate a mention in today's collectors' catalogues. But there were some exceptions.
Oh, look. Goodness gracious, mate. What is it? It would be a shilling, it's silver. In very good condition.
Very good.
In fact, I can read the date. 1824. Before Melbourne was here.
When you dig on a site and you come up with the artefacts, the physical evidence that the people used, it just immediately evokes a scene of life of that period. Ceramics, glass, all the other items, they just give us a very detailed picture of what life was like at the time. What I envisage when I think of Little Lon is the physical aspects of it. What the laneways look like, the little 1- and 2-storey cottages, mainly brick and stone, but the occasional timber one, crammed in quite tight, smoke from the chimneys, a bit of a pall, and the smell. That place would have stunk. And walking down those laneways would have been a fairly delicate affair. And the main life in the back streets, Little Lonsdale and the laneways, George's Lane and other ones, have been just people, lots of people coming and going. You know, horses and carts and drays up and down the main streets, Lonsdale Street, and with 8 hotels on the site. There would have been lots of activity around those pubs as well.
Well, one of the things about people who were poor or who lived in bad housing in the 19th century is that they didn't really leave many written records. So if you want to find out about their lives, you've really got to look at what other people said about them. Try and read between the lines in everything you come across, I think. And it's hard to get to the details of everyday life without having it filtered through somebody else's perspective.
There was a great tradition in Melbourne in the 19th century of slummer journalism, created by writers like Marcus Clarke and John Stanley James, the Vagabond. And they titillated their audiences with scenes of debauchery and vice and lowlife in the back slums of Melbourne. Later writers and even some 20th century historians have responded to these images of the old inner city in the 19th century as if they were historical truth.
C.J. Dennis captured something of the place and time in The Sentimental Bloke.
They scraps in old Verona with their swords and never give a bloke a stray dog's chance. And that's romance. But when they deals it out with bricks and boots in Little Lon, they're low degraded brutes.
These low degrading brutes were as much victims as villains.
Of course, there was a lot of crime in the area. People who don't have much money have got to try and live by whatever means possible, and that includes picking pockets and maybe knocking people over the head and a bit of prostitution. But I think the important thing about the area is to try and see through those myths and to see that this is a community of people who were at the bottom of the pile, really, when it came to jobs or to housing, and they're really just trying to get by. I don't think archaeology is really going to tell us anything new about the area. I think historians over the last 10 years have discovered quite a lot about this area by reading through official sources and looking at those sources critically. But what I think the archaeology does is that it throws up a different quality of that history, that when we're confronted by bits and pieces, say a bit of a pipe or a vase or a child's toy of somebody who lived in that area, it strikes us much more immediately than reading through police records.
On this site here, the documentary history, the published sources have looked at the low life of the site. It was supposedly a slum, a back slum, rife with prostitution and crime, and that's the aspect that's been publicised, and it comes through in the documentary records that was happening here. But what the archaeology shows is more of the picture. It shows that there are ordinary women and children, men, women and children, working class, middle class, living here for a whole variety of reasons.
Little Lon was on the fringe of town, and it was an area of narrow alleys, tiny houses, stables and pubs. By the 1890s, the Chinese had drifted to Little Lon when the gold rush petered out. It was the beginning of what is now celebrated as Melbourne's Chinatown, but in the 19th century, the dominant sentiment was one of racist fear. Of particular concern was the Chinese habit of using opium. In 1 year, Melbourne consumed 50,000 pounds of the stuff, but it was legal and considered medicinal. What's interesting about this photograph from the 1880s is the hint of the presence of a well-dressed woman of society.
All of us wrong, along, make life a happy song. Let's take a trip to Melbourne. There's lots to do and through. A welcome waits for you. So let's take a trip to Melbourne. Come along and greet that you can see the Melbourne Cup and see the air race finish. Watch the numbers going up. So follow us wrong, along.
There's no doubt the upper classes did enjoy vices of their own, and slumming in Little Lon was a popular pastime. It was a vibrant part of the city, full of diversions. Many of the visitors were men looking for sex.
It was a narrow street that we were in. Little Lon was a very narrow street with a narrow footpath, and the girls were always on the left-hand side coming up from Spencer Street. And there weren't so many of them. There might have been 15 or 20 little places there. But they were always leant on the door like this, and they had a cigarette. And they had very thin clothes on, and they had a bright light behind them. And that's what, as you went along, there was the outline of the girls and their light, not necessarily silk, but something like that, you know. And just enough to say they were wearing clothes. But, you paid your 5 shillings, and I'll give them their due. You didn't have to pay until afterwards. They were very humane. The sailors, they all passed on the news. But when you get to Melbourne, so-and-so and so-and-so, that was all it was done. It was by word of mouth. They all knew every sailor, and not the officers. They were a different style altogether. But the ordinary battlers, they all knew where the brothels were.
In 1854, the Argus thundered its disapproval, calling Little Lon
A disgrace to the city and a greater disgrace to the police. Almost every house is occupied by females of the lowest and most disreputable class.
5 years later, the situation had deteriorated. There were over 190 brothels in Melbourne.
Melbourne swarms with prostitutes. In the street they may be seen at all times, frequently without their bonnets.
They rendezvous at the Theatre Royal bars for special practice of their seductive arts.
Melbourne was booming, riding on the wealth of the gold rushes. Its population doubled in less than 20 years. Little Lon found itself conveniently located in the dark alleys just behind the glittering theatres and clubs. In October 1891, the mace from Parliament House went missing. A great scandal followed when it was rumoured that it had found its way to Boccaccio House, a notorious brothel favoured by some members of Parliament.
The mace was not stolen, but taken from Parliament by some festive cusses for a lark, and is even now, so it is freely stated, in a bawdy house in Melbourne where it has been used in low travesties of parliamentary procedure.
This was never proven, and mysteriously, the mace was never found.
After the excavation phase had finished, we had to do research to establish who had lived where on the site. We looked at City Council records and police records to look at mainly where prostitution and criminal activities had taken place within the area. And there was just a massive rate book information, literally hundreds of thousands of records, and we tracked each particular subdivision of land right from 1848 up until about 1920, so that we know who lived in each house each year on the block over that whole period. And then we can look at the sites where we've got rubbish pits and cesspits, and we can say in some cases that this particular material belonged to certain people. And that's an incredible link to be able to make on a site like this.
Although the dig revealed little direct evidence to support the reputation of Little Lon, it provided a unique insight into the lives of ordinary people.
Well, I suppose to me these little things aren't great works of art or anything, but they do evoke, I think, the quality of everyday life in the area. I mean, this is a Chinese medicine bowl, and we knew that there were Chinese living in the area. We probably knew they made medicines and sold medicines or involved in herbalism, but I mean, just to have these little ordinary items sitting here, I mean, it does really bring out, I suppose, the quality of day-to-day life, and the fact that you've got something tangible that links you back to Chinese Melbourne in the 1880s or 1870s, I think is something really valuable and exciting. The little sheep here, I mean, it's not the big merino at Goulburn or anything, but it's perhaps a child's toy. It's something out of a pastoral scene, a Christmas crib or something, and a nice little white object in an area that was always painted as dark and gloomy and nasty, and it's got a sort of nice little feeling of innocence about it. The hair comb, the knit comb, of course the area was always identified with ill health and dangers to people's bodies as much as to their souls, and lice and nits and all those sorts of nasty things that you're always going to find in poor housing and where people are crammed together in bad living conditions. The fact that you can imagine somebody actually having to scrape through their children's hair every day with this comb to keep nits out is something that brings you up with a shock, I think.
I think we've gone past the great man theory of history where we studied presidents and governors and kings. We're now studying the common man, his contribution, and the Commonwealth site has provided a great deal of information as far as the lifestyle, activities, and that of the common man.
This item tells us about trade networks and trade patterns. It tells us about the economy of the time. It tells us about personal is it personal preference they had this, or was it a price preference? They couldn't afford better quality than that, or was it availability? Was that all that was coming into the colony? Why wasn't stuff coming down from Sydney where it was being made at that time? Why is it all imported? It opens up the whole macro view of what was happening in Melbourne at the time, as well it gives us some minute view of individual lives. Some of the really high quality goods could have been heirloom pieces, or they may in fact have been used in some of the high class brothels that were there, and when they got broken they got thrown out. And we found some purpose dug pits that weren't cess pits. They were dug as rubbish pits, and one of them contained at least 600 champagne bottles and the remains of hundreds of oyster shells, plus various articles of clothing, shoes, women's clothing, men's clothing. And we think that was definitely behind a little two-room cottage on Lonsdale Street that was a brothel.
Cesspits were in common use until the turn of the century, and they frequently overflowed. Epidemics of infectious disease were common.
In the 1880s, Melbourne was one of the worst cities in the world.
for the incidence of contagious diseases, typhoid, diphtheria, all the filth diseases. And in 1888 and 1889, in particular, 100 years ago, Melbourne had record epidemics. It had a sanitary crisis. Here you had Melbourne, a large city of upwards of 500,000 people, and still without an efficient sewerage and filth removal system. Each little cottage had its own cesspit. Of course, these cesspits were defective. They leaked, they overflowed. There's even some suspicion that the filth actually leaked into the water supply, so you had people actually drinking their own filth. And of course, disease was going to spread under those circumstances.
This material from the little Lonsdale Street dig comes to us looking like this, anybody's old lot of dirt. And all the large material's already been taken out of it. And what we're looking for in this material are small seeds.
Through scientific analysis, the contents of these pits revealed some details of the dietary fare of Little Lon's inhabitants.
There are actually three main fruit seeds that we've found in the deposit. First of all, grape, and then some much smaller ones. They are raspberry seeds, and those, of course, are really very small. And finally, the smallest seeds of all, which are fig seeds. And we've found some thousands of each of these particular seeds. So we are actually delving in somebody's latrine pit, really. There's a pretty fair chance that what we're looking at was what had passed through the human gut.
Keeping with their concern for the history of the area, the developers have agreed to retain a number of significant early buildings.
This house where we're standing now is 17 Castleton Place, which is a single-storey workers' cottage, which would have been very common throughout this part of Melbourne in the 19th century. They contain two main rooms, which we can see on this building flanking the doorway, and they also have a small courtyard at the rear which contains an outbuilding and a toilet. Can imagine very easily how crowded those houses would have been with entire families and perhaps some cottage industries going on inside them.
The house at 17 Castleton Place is one of the last workingmen's cottages left in the central business district of Melbourne. It's fitting that it is to be incorporated into the new development as part of a museum.
We have to build a 40-storey building next to a two-room single-storey cottage. So the challenge is, as an architect, is how does one design a complex that in some ways that can live with the heritage precinct in which we have just retained. High-rise office buildings, as you can see from out there, are basically an American import because they're an American invention. We are basically an English city. We have an American import. And architects have to learn to cope with the scale relationship, which I have to cope with it now, to transform a high building into a very complex, delicate environment.
The only evidence of life before colonisation was quite unexpected.
We had not expected to find large stumps of gum trees in an urban setting like this, and we did, and everybody got terribly excited, including the demolishers. You know, it was just not an archaeological excitement, it was a general excitement that here was an artefact that took you back to the old landscape of Melbourne.
Although the dig was extraordinarily thorough and the material carefully studied, there was not a single piece of evidence suggesting the site was occupied before the arrival of Europeans in 1837. Yet people lived in the region of Melbourne for at least 15,000 years before that. This is not as surprising as it may seem, since the material evidence of that ancient culture would have been on the surface and wiped out by the first sweep of a plough and the foundations of the earliest buildings. The material that was once under the ground where this building now stands has been brought to the surface. It has been painstakingly catalogued, studied and stored for future generations. These tangible details from the past present us with a sense of place, past, present, and future. History has meaning only if someone takes the trouble to search through the evidence and preserve the findings for the future. Little Lon will never be the same, but perhaps future generations will wander through its once crowded lanes and be glad that when they dug up its past, they didn't throw it all away.